as a country, if you just look at it top down, there are like 30 odd officially recognized languages in the country. So there's no monoculture that exists, right? And every state, every 50 kilometers that you go, there is a completely new cultural environment that you would find yourself in India. But then the question is like, okay, if you go down that rabbit hole, how far down the rabbit hole do you go? And this really works out when you have all the compelling pieces in place and you're really trying to dominate the market. You want to capture the grassroots, go down the esports route. Makes absolute sense, right? Don't try to do everything simultaneously. Figure out the incrementality and then build on top of it, right? Build conviction and then go deeper. But purely doing that at the forefront itself might not be the best trade off that you would be making from an investment perspective in terms of your product roadmap.
Hi, I am Sophie Vaux, and this is the Rise and Play podcast. A few weeks ago, I had a wonderful and transformative experience in India during IGDC, and I want to share the key learnings with you. Great leadership comes from everywhere, and I want to bring perspectives from the East to the West so that we can continue learning from each other. In this special series, I am sitting down with 5 studio founders to offer a broad perspective on the gaming ecosystem in India now, ranging from early-stage companies to more mature stages, from bootstrap to VC-backed, from casual to mid-core, serving the global or the local market. Are you ready to challenge your beliefs and perception? Let's begin. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Rise and Play, and in our special series about India. Today I'll be more on the investment, pure business side, and sitting today with Vivek Ramachandran, who is currently leading media, social and gaming investment for Matrix Partners India, and who is working as an early stage investor. And before Vivek, you have been also in the gaming industry on the development side, where you worked at EA. We'll get into that, where you were overseeing across multiple mobile games throughout the EA portfolio. So you've seen also different sides of the business on the development, and also you've been yourself more in the business entrepreneurship even before you got into games, and we get into that. But I was super excited. First, I met you at IGDC. Also, you had a whole talk that we were just talking about it. So I'll link it in the show notes around what makes a good VC backable business in India, which I think it's a great topic and that many could benefit from when you start to build a company. And before you ask and raise money, what are the things you should think of, consider, and even ask yourself if that's the route you want to go to. So I'm super excited to get that side of a conversation with you. Sure, I can hear the insights from the game developers of the passion, the creativity, but at the end of the day, it's important to have also the business side. And then as you get money, the return on investment and the growth, and we will touch on today, particularly for India, but also growing globally. So welcome, Vivek. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you for the kind introduction and also making it to IGDC and having your presence over here was fantastic. It was just refreshing to hear your perspectives on all things gaming and super excited to dive deeper into the opportunities that could probably lay in this market.
So let's get into it. And before we do, I'd love to hear more about your background and your journey into entrepreneurship, business, maybe investment and games that led you to go to Matrix Partner and maybe focus more on gaming and the opportunities you see with all your background and experience.
So my journey with games began quite early, have been on the sidelines of the development scene ever since early 2000s. So my early experience in the games industry was working as an open source contributor to the early modding communities around the RPG games, had been developing a bunch of mods and trainers in the very early days, right? So this is pre-multiplayer when folks were still quite heavy on creating those custom experiences. I think that's really where I started getting into the depth of playing or figuring out what makes a game work rather than just being a superficial customer of the games themselves. Early on, I was in management consulting, working on heavy engineering problems in India. Subsequently realized that there are enterprise SaaS level problems to be solved for number crunching. So I ended up building an econometrics platform for forecasting demand. Surprisingly, a lot of use cases and the customers ended up being gaming companies. And that was my aha moment that game companies are not just entertainment products, but deeply analytical, rigorously scientifically built products. And that really gave me the push to join the games industry in a meaningful fashion. Began at EA. I ended up leading product and platform engineering over various functions, worked with Slingshot, PopCap Studios, and part of it with other partner studios across the globe. Had an opportunity to work with the diverse set of games that EA used to run, all the way from Plants vs. Zombies to Bejeweled to Need for Speed. And all of this period of time, I had been an angel investor ever since my first exit, have backed 20 plus companies, and decided that's a part of my life that I really enjoy a lot. And India as a market was evolving to a point where things started to get like really exciting. And I currently lead investments on the media, social, and gaming sectors for Matrix Partners. It's an early stage VC fund, global fund. There are three funds. One is a fund in China, one is in US, and I invest out of the India vehicle. It's a $550 million fund. We are currently in fund four, and I've backed companies out of India ever since 2006.
Wow.
So super excited about the broader media and entertainment sector and how gaming is shaping up. It's in its stages of nascency, and this is the right time for us to go back great teams with full conviction.
Well, that's quite a large fund, and it's quite interesting that India sits. I don't know if it's the same level, but the fact that it has a hub by itself alongside China and US, it's also telling. And for the size of a fund you have for investment, how big or maybe more the potential of games is among like you said, media, entertainment industry. What is the proportion, if you even have like a percentage or, rough size?
Yeah. So we are a sector agnostic fund. I don't think that as a fund we are super sector focused, but I think it does fall back on how the representation of the GDP itself is, right? So if you look at Matrix investment portfolio over the past decade or so, you would see significant investments in the fintech portfolio, which India has really seen an exponential growth. We've been fortunate enough to be early backers of companies like Razorpay in India, and on the consumer tech side, on mobility side, I've backed companies like Ola, which is the de facto ride sharing platform over here in India. So I think the fund philosophy has been to back founders from their earliest stages itself, right? So that means that we typically invest anywhere from seed to Series B. That tends to be our sweet spot of investing. And there is no specific sector, specific allocation of how we plan to deploy funds. It is more opportunity backwards and the kind of founders who we want to partner with. Especially, would love to work with founders who have really ambitious goals of trying to capture this market in a meaningful fashion. I think that's broadly the fund philosophy.
So, as you shared more also about being a sector agnostic and investing in wherever the growth is, the teams, what is interesting for me to understand is more on a larger scale of India and growth and consumer trends. What are you seen as growth in terms of product, consumer products, service products that would help us to have an overview to understand how games fit and entertainment inside the overall growth in India as I would say Indian consumers probably are growing their wallet, their budget to be more consumers. So if you could provide a broader view on that.
Let's just get the top line facts off the way, right? India is an extraordinarily large consumer market with population, I think, getting closer to about 1.4 billion at this point of time. For the longest period of time, I think it's fairly easy to look at in terms of like epochs, right? So before 1990 was the pre-liberalization era. India had been trailing China in terms of pretty much all sort of development metrics, right? But what we had seen is the IT services and exports industry really did pick up, and India did become the center for IT services industry, which is already 150 billion plus in terms of total export value. But beyond that, the consumer market itself took its sweet time to get to a stage of maturity and inflection. And I think two interesting things happened in India, right? Compared to a lot of other Western markets, there was a leapfrogging in terms of technology. As mobile technologies became much more relevant, India and the bulk of the Indian consumer population directly went digitally native without ever entering into the broadband phase at all. So you would see hundreds of millions of consumers who would have never used a PC in their past lives, but are extremely comfortable using a smartphone, right? So I think that is a wave that really took its prominence in the 2010s when companies like Jio really started investing heavily on networking infrastructure and enabling consumers to be connected digital, right? So the India stack, as you would hear it from a bunch of my colleagues, really started emerging, which is really the combination of the core underlying networking and communications technology, fast, accessible internet pretty much across the landmass at extremely high speeds, accessible, cheap data rates, easily available smartphones, and then various services and technologies that are being built on top of that, right? So UPI, as you would keep on hearing, really enabled instant payments in India, and that is just transformative for a country which was doing almost 80% of all transactions in cash. And it went through that extremely rapid phase of shift over, and that really enabled a whole bunch of businesses to exist in India and really grow, right? So, for example, on the e-commerce and the consumer front, we had companies like Flipkart come out, which was eventually acquired by Walmart. They started out with a pure play cash on delivery business model, but then they eventually grew their business. Now they're distributing their products pretty much across India, right, to hundreds of thousands of pin codes. And by and large, it has been riding on top of this digital adoption wave. And I think the second key trend line that has really mattered is there has been a consistent improvement on the GDP front, right? The GDP per capita is improving. The overall GDP of the country itself is improved. There is a lot of residual wealth in consumers' hands. So if you look at it purely from Maslow's perspective, people are used to be purely worried about sustenance in the earlier phases. Now there is a lot more discretionary wealth that they need to figure out how to sort of consume. And obviously early on your e-commerce and discretionary consumer spends come into picture. And I think that is where media entertainment really slots in well, right? As your surplus in the society increases, there is a lot more accessibility to entertain yourself. Various forms of entertainment really start making its roots into the country, right? And India as a country has always been extremely gung-ho about entertainment and media products. If you look at the history of Bollywood or movies dating all the way back to the 70s, right? They have been the pretty much at the center of cultural phenomena here in India. And that is pretty much seamlessly transitioning onto the digital landscape, pretty much people making WhatsApp and Facebook as Indian as it gets in terms of sheer population, but also truly native Indian experiences being coming out on how they consume and engage content with platforms like ShareChat, really gaining like 100 million plus consumer base, right? So I think a major shift that happened was moving away from this linear entertainment consumption onto consuming more of interactive engagement content. So games completely skipped a few generations and directly went into mobile, and that's where people really started getting deeper into that form of an entertainment experience. And it was right in time for free to play, so there was almost no barriers of entry, and that really meant that for most of the game publishers worldwide, India just became number one in terms of download size. But the revenue markets were still lagging, but we are already seeing signs of that slowly catching up.
It's good to have a history, and you tracked it back from 2010, which for me was my first time in India. And it's not that I've looked at the market closely since maybe this year, where suddenly it just popped out of some other more global media and gaming, and say like there's growth, and I was connected with a few people there. But it makes a lot of sense in the growth progress. And one key thing for me was the mobile distribution. I like also get insights on the ground, and seeing there everybody with a mobile. That was fascinating. I didn't know what to expect, but I saw, okay, everyone has a mobile phone. And second, the payment. I was coming in a very naive, maybe old thinking way with my cash. And then nobody wanted my cash. So it was all QR code and UPI system. And I was, oh, wow, what is this? And I wish we had that actually in Europe. In Germany, we're still very cash heavy, especially in Berlin. From the moment you have the phone, you have all the services possible. Even for a foreigner visitor, you need the ride. You can go to Olo as a platform, or even Uber, all the similar food delivery, same. I've heard recently also more about edtech. There's a lot of attempt there on how to distribute education at scale. So this is very impressive. And I can see the speed just like now today, where it will be in a few years. And I haven't been able to experience or consume yet what I would call more local platforms of entertainment. I know the global ones like the Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, and so on are distributing. Are there some that are more adapted locally that also are growing big as a platform that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and it probably segues neatly into how broader country or the consumer market can be segmented into, right? There is this top tier population, roughly anywhere between like 5 to 20 million population, who does act, behave, and spend like the Western audience in
Mm.
terms of their broader purchasing power. They are probably your Netflix and Disney Plus subscribers of the world. And even for these businesses, they still see India as a massive growth market because that had been underpenetrated for them for the longest part, and they've seen substantial increases in terms of their overall subscriber count and the broader revenue that they're generating from these customer bases, right? But beyond that, there is the broader 300, 400 million odd users who are early digitally native, just started using digital consumer platforms the last 5 to 10 years. And there are some very interesting consumer platforms that have emerged, which really have taken roots and have captured the popular imagination, right? So I think ShareChat is probably a very interesting example to call out. It's a local communication social media platform which have reached a fairly large scale, and you would see a lot of vernacular localization, a lot of content that is contextualized to India, and that just finds a lot more deeper grassroots appeal beyond the top tier metro city living consumer population, right? But beyond that, you also see these interesting new pockets of businesses emerging. For example, audio streaming is something that is seeing a lot of activity and consumer spends even in India for that matter, right? So this is episodic audio based content which is generally released out to the public population, and
Mm.
these businesses are purely relying on microtransactions led monetization, which a lot of people assumed wouldn't work in India. Even us were culpable for some of those mistakes, sitting in large publishers assuming that this market will never convert, right? Those rules seem to be shifting away, and from our vantage point, it's quite clear that there is an at least 20 to 50 million consumer population who's willing to spend on microtransactions every single month, and that is just not trivial, right? It does appear that it is going to be a lower ARPDAU compared to a lot of other Western markets, but still, there are pockets of spend that really can be tapped into and valuable businesses can be made, right? So there are multiple evidences like Kuku FM, Pocket FM have done that in the audio streaming space. We are yet to see a completely localized at scale success for traditional video games yet, but we have already seen that play out on the real money gaming category, which is already an extremely successful subsegment within the broader gaming umbrella, right? And as a fund, we have made a few investments in the real money gaming space in the past, which have gone on to do extremely well in terms of the broader business. But there are regulatory headwinds which are affecting that specific industry, and now we see a lot of attention shifting back into traditional free to play. And hopefully, within the next couple of years, we'll start seeing more localized, deeply authentic games being made out of India for India.
So, as we are converging slowly from overall consumption, consumer demand to entertainment, and as we get into games, let's get into the topic of indeed games for or from India. And maybe starting from the lens of Matrix Partner, what are the opportunities you started to see over the past years? I spent a bit of time with Lumike where I saw their perspective as well from the studio side. What is it that you have seen as first emerging trend of professionals from India in games, but also the potential of what kind of new entertainment products that could be distributed either locally or globally? What are your thoughts, whether personal or from the Matrix partner?
Yeah, fair question, and something that we deliberate over quite deeply over here in the fund and among the game developer communities, right? It is beyond any question for anyone at this point of time that there is a large consumer market which has a significant appetite for content. I think the sticking points always has been, is there the right kind of talent mix which can execute and build world-class games? If a team decides to strategically focus on India as a market, can there be a large and profitable enough business that can be made? And see is if one and two adds up, why not distribute and create games for the global market, right? I think these are the broad three thematic areas that we worry about. And folks do have differing positions across each of these particular areas, right? Different funds have different perspectives. And as far as we are concerned, what we have developed conviction is on the development side, the supply side of this business, right? The content production and the talent which is required to build and scale games is slowly but steadily shaping up to be globally competitive, right? This has been true for the broader concept art, video editing, VFX, and the hardline production side of things for the last 5 to 10 years. And global studios have been using a lot of offshoring to really leverage on some of that cost arbitrage for the longest period of time. And that slowly shifted into global publishers like Ubisoft, Take Two, as well as EA, setting up their shops in India and primarily expanding their presence, right? And each of them are easily 500,000 member plus operations across functions. They all started as pure offshoring of their non-core operations from their more higher cost locations in the West. So EA has been in India since like 2005-6. They came in through acquisitions, and Zynga has been in India since early 2010s as well. And those teams and those locations evolved from being purely these offshore plays on to being larger live operations capability expansion teams, which completely have taken over games which were being run in the West, being run out of here, optimizing and growing these live service businesses, right? And both of these locations have been able to do that extremely well. And now Scopely is also doing that with post the acquisition of GSN in India. What that has meant is that now the production bench strength, apart from your core art and VFS strength, is being bolstered by more live service strength. People really understand how to build free to play mechanics, how to scale and optimize a game from its existing state, expand the lifetime value of those games, and really extract value from it, right? Those two critical pieces of understanding has really matured, and the product management and the engineering talent at this point of time is globally comparable to what we have elsewhere, right? Where a lot of challenges still remain on the supply side is still on the 0 to 1 game creation in itself. How do you think about creating something truly innovative and then putting it out there and then seeing how that works out is an area where folks will have to take enough shots at the target in order to make something work, because until somebody has done it, it has not been done yet, right? Because the larger publishers did not
Mm.
have enough conviction to take that bet out of the studio locations in India. But that constraint doesn't apply to any of the startups, right? So their advantages, I guess, at this point of time is that they're operating at an extremely big arbitrage of operating cost of a gaming studio, but there is enough amount of investor appetite to capitalize them at the same extent that a global studio would be capitalized, which would have implications in how much runway do they have and how much shots at target they could take at building a new game. And you've already talked to some of those early developers across the casual spectrum who are taking a very meaningful and thoughtful approach at building this. And our ecosystem has currently matured to a point where there are more than 30 plus early stage, purely casual studios who are venture backed and are trying to build their games 0 to 1. And even in the mid core category, there are at least a good handful of companies which are fairly well capitalized and trying to make mid core categories work. But predominantly, the action has been on the mobile side. Right. So on the talent ecosystem, this is where we are at. Reasonably high degree of confidence that this is improving. On 0 to 1, we need to see more evidence, but we are willing to take bets on the right team composition, right? With the right kind of combination of strengths and competencies that folks currently have. If they're able to put something together, I think there is a compelling enough case for something great to be built out of here.
Mm. And I do see that as well, discussing with some of the teams, and it makes sense as well from learning from all the big company and publishers, the production pipeline, art, just efficiency, of shipping or especially operating big live games. I think it's remarkable as well. Some of the teams I've talked to that are from GSN, quite a big revenues, games that make over 50 million per year. It's not, small games at all,
Yep.
and operating large teams of 100 people. So I think that production capacity for sure, and having mastering more over the years, it's a great skill to have when exactly scaling a game and the product and operating it well, which is also the start of a game. If you think about it, yeah, you push it, you have an initial traction, but how you grow the game is as important. So that's good to have that part covered. What I'm curious to hear about is indeed that 0 to 1, and what if we can narrow it down to some specific skills that haven't been maybe developed or pushed that far, especially in the context of mobile free to play, that some of the studio, even with the best intent and serious capital, because we talk about some in seed round, I've talked to 1 to 2 million, sometimes even 20 million, I've heard. It's serious money to go and run for a long time, especially with the costs of development in India in that context. However, money will not solve it. And what are the gaps that need to be resolved in terms of craft? And maybe some ideas, some thoughts of how could we help this grow in India, whether it's coming from outside or inside the country?
Yeah. So I think really it starts from having really great game design bench strength in terms of finding the right talent sources as well. Really great game designers varying all the way from somebody who can anchor the overall process from ideation to figuring out how the art cell is going to be, how the core game mechanic needs to be, how does a core loop work, how does a meta loop work, how do you sort of tie all of that together? Because a game is not just a function of the hard production effort that you just put into it. It needs to come out as a compelling product and a narrative. And I think there, the lack of experience definitely something that needs to be bridged. But beyond that, there are a couple of areas where there has just been a degree of inexperience or just lack of thereof, especially on the performance and user acquisition growth side of things, right? Predominantly because the nature of these operations, again, from the large publishers, which have pretty much been the base of the talent bench, that has not been the primary focus. Right? The primary focus has been on post-launch live operations, which is more on the optimization side, but not necessarily on the growth side, right? So how do you really think about spending marketing dollars on acquiring users deterministically? How do you bring them on board? How do you really ensure that you are paying back the money that you're spending on each of these cohorts? And how do you sort of scale this campaign across multiple geographies and then tie it all back into the feedback into the product roadmap itself is an area where a lot of experience needs to sort of come in, either by virtue of taking enough shots at target or from sourcing or bridging those gaps from other markets, right? So those are two areas where we feel like there are still gaps that need to be covered. But the challenge is really when the ambition really scales up from not just trying to serve to an Indian market, which obviously has its own challenges, but when you take that ambition a step further and then say that, hey, now we want to go after the global audience, because at that point of time, you need to
Mm.
be competitive globally against probably better capitalized folks or probably folks who would have had better experience. So you really need to stack up these advantages in your favor. And I think the biggest advantage is the number of shots that they can take at the target and they can really optimize over there, not being hung up on their prior expectations on what good looks like, and then really being hypothesis driven is a cultural trait that I have found to be there, and folks are open to thinking about it. And I think that is just fantastic given the current difficult conditions that exist around mobile ecosystem.
It's not the same number of shots exactly of testing, experimenting, launching than you would do in Europe. Maybe you launch 1, 2 games during that times. That's the
Mm.
average I hear. And it's also a mindset and way of working. But here, with the same amount of capital, you could, I don't know, multiply it by 4, even 5, just by the speed and not being attached, not having that bar that is crazy, that you're more experimenting and learning. I see this as an opportunity with the studio intentionally, whoever is in charge more of a product strategy, take that road of, okay, let's be intentional of the number of attempts we have and how we pursue and persist in the direction to find the novel thing that we want to create in that segment. That I think is more a luxury for some studios that could be from India and other places where it's just so expensive.
Yeah.
And even the cost, of acquisition.
Think about it from like the other lens, right? So globally, there are
Mm.
some answers on how some of these subgenres have played out, but still, a lot of times the question remains: what is a truly India native format of gameplay which will just become a breakout success and dominate in that market? And I think those answers
Mm.
have not been extremely obvious. We have seen the shooter market perform extremely well. BGMI, PUBG have done phenomenally well, and their business numbers are nothing to scoff at from purely the perspective of what kind of money that they make in India. But they're not necessarily game mechanics or formats that were natively designed for the Indian market specifically, right? And I think this is the part where there tends to be a lot of disconnect because there is a lot of Western pop culture acclimatization that has happened in India. It's relatively much more receptive to content which is made for a global audience than, for example, what a Japan could be, right? And that has been great for the global publishers to take shots at Indian market, but it has not necessarily been extremely dedicated and focused efforts, right? So having the ability to take multiple shots at target for Indian developers would also mean that they can actually go out and try to find really native formats. For example, Ludo is one of those formats which have worked out extremely well. It's a
Mm.
board game that has had cultural roots. It has worked out extremely well for us on the RMG front. But similarly, I'm sure there are many of those games that are out there which has deep cultural context can be brought onto a digitally native format and then scaled up and build a successful business around, right? So I think it's the opportunity and ability to do some of those that also really matter a lot.
Mm. That leads us to the question more of for India or global. It's an interesting one because I've seen different takes direction. I don't know if it's a controversial topic where it's neither this or that, but for sure, one point you mentioned is about exploring if we were putting the effort into making it really adapted to the audience, how far can we go and how much opportunities, revenues, growth is there. And so I give a few examples here of what I've heard and seen so far. So, for example, the Bombay Play, they built from India, but for the rest of the world. So there's not claiming that we do it for India, especially for the Bombay Play company, not for the Moonfront Labs, which had a different focus. There's also a personal story here. You have founders, Indians, who are full Indian team founders, who have been in other companies before, have understood the market. So that first iteration happened. And the take is we want to tell the story that haven't been told and we want to be behind. So we want to create. So there's an aspiration to create something really personal that is personal to us as a team. And that's, I would say, integrated even in the culture for India players first, and great if it can scale globally. We're not against it or limiting ourselves to it, but we start first from India. And then you are others like distributing just globally. So what have you seen? What are your thoughts there? Maybe the potential, maybe the limits for the listeners to consider coming again more from the pure business side.
Yeah. No, I think as a game team, it is perfectly natural to aspire to do either of those things, right? Either to say that, hey, I want to make a game purely for the Indian audience, build it ground up, it's a love letter for the audience, sort of an aspiration, versus saying that I will completely go after the global audience because there is nothing really stopping us from going after the global audience as long as the quality bar sort of meets the expectation, right? So I think both are perfectly valid approaches for a game team to take. And like you rightly mentioned, it really depends a lot on the kind of culture that exists within these studio teams. But I think from a business perspective, it is probably important to appreciate what are the efforts in terms of localization or culturalization which would move the needle versus what might not necessarily do that, right? So if you think about it, for example, for the lack of a better example, let's pick shooters as a category, right? Would the players accept a subpar quality game purely because it has characters who have much more cultural context and affinity? Probably not. They would definitely have slight degree of preference over another game if the gameplay is just as good, if the graphics and visual fidelity is just as good. But there are also cultural and local contextual elements which make the gameplay and the narrative slightly bit more compelling, right? So the question is the incremental investments or the difference in product strategy sufficient enough for you to carve out that niche? And probably the answer doesn't really lie in just customizing a few characters or the skins per se. It is really about, can I deliver on the quality expectations that the players have, which are at a global standard right now? Because I might as well download a Call of Duty right now or a FIFA right now if I want to play in those categories. What is my right to win versus those games? And can I offer a compelling enough alternative for that product? Right, and we are not even getting into distribution at this point of time, because then the second question is, okay, we are able to craft this extraordinary product. Do I have an advantage to distribute on this market at a higher efficiency than someone else could? Right, so that's where a lot of those intricate market understandings hopefully will come into play for many of these make in India for India games and game developers. I think their nuanced understanding of what appeals to customers, how can you reach out to them, how do you build influence, really would come into picture. And we have seen some excellent execution from both Garena as well as the PUBG groups, really building grassroots level esports. And Robbie and team are building out a super gaming also have a phenomenal bottoms up approach on doing this, right? They are talking to the deep power players of these games. They are talking to the influencers and building this IP from ground up, which I think is a remarkable and an ambitious shot at that target, right? But the word of caution for broadly folks who are trying to do it is, just don't index on localizing 10 different languages or adding 5 different characters and expect that will change the fortune of your game, because it most likely will not.
I really love how you put more here reality check perspective, indeed, at the end of the day, you will not have a free pass on lowering the quality. You need to be on par with the global quality. And then the added value on top of the quality is more how you can resonate, relate to the story of a game, the context, and so on. But that will not be a trade-off with the quality.
Yeah, that's not a trade-off that the customers will be okay to take.
Yeah, yeah. And the distribution indeed. And there was a funny feedback I got, funny in the sense like it was a finding for me about the languages. I was talking to one of the casual studio where the tech is indeed distributing first in India, understanding what a good puzzle game for Indian consumer puzzle player would be, and saying English actually was the preferred language from the feedback because it's almost a status. I want to play a game in English. It looks better for me, feels better that I can play in English and not in my pure local language. And that was surprising. So it solved your problem more easily, I guess, if you don't have to translate. But that was an interesting finding. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, on the localization front, right? I think the interesting bit is that as a country, if you just look at it top down, there are like 30 odd officially recognized languages in the country. So there's no monoculture that exists, right? And every state, every 50 kilometers that you go, there is a completely new cultural environment that you would find yourself in India. But then the question is like, okay, if you go down that rabbit hole, how far down the rabbit hole do you go? Do I go out and localize every single language, or do I say that, hey, Hindi probably covers like 40% of the broader market, and English probably has coverage of the top 300 million? Probably let me just do that, both of them extremely well, and then think deeply about, do I need to add an incremental language which will help me build an incremental reach in that specific sub market, right? I think unless you are at that level of understanding of where your player base is and what their expectations are, it's probably futile to just go headlong and localize and make that a priority before you get a lot of the other sticking points. I think that's a larger point that really matters, right? And this really works out when you have all the compelling pieces in place and you're really trying to dominate the market. You want to capture the grassroots, go down the esports route. Makes absolute sense, right? Go to Bengali, go to other languages which really have deep pockets and have tight knit behavior, and then try to win there, right? But broadly, the guidance generally always has been that don't try to do everything simultaneously. Pick up the lower hanging ones, figure out the incrementality, and then build on top of it, right? Build conviction and then go deeper. But purely doing that at the forefront itself might not be the best trade off that you would be making from an investment perspective in terms of your product roadmap.
Yeah, totally. And it's the same mindset when from the West, as we build products, we build first for the audience we know that exists, the West, in the US, English, in all English speaking countries, and then later we localize to grow additional revenues. So we never started with French, for example, or, so that's also the same mindset here. If we take at the scale of India, start where you have a mass and reach, and then specialize where you can see the ROI of certain area for specialization.
Yeah.
My last question as we close this conversation today, thanks a lot. Like it was great to have the broad view and getting more into games, and there's so much more to discuss, but probably offline. Looking towards the future and where you are today, you at Matrix Partner, what are you excited about the studio you're talking to, whether it's in India or globally? And maybe for the listeners here, what are you looking for, the teams, but people who should talk to you at this point?
Yeah. As I said before, right, extremely excited about the opportunity for large value creation to happen out of the developers in this market. It is extremely reasonable that there would be 25 to 50 odd companies who are doing meaningful business in gaming in India, doing healthy and profitable business, right? And there are already multiple businesses in India which are scaled up above like 30, 40 million ARR in revenue, completely bootstrapped, not really having put in a lot of money in order to make something work, right? So clearly there is a high capital efficiency, high consumer interest business to be built out. Developers are already paying attention, investors are already paying attention. But then there are these gaps that we talked about that would need to be resolved. I think the broader intent for us is to catch these teams as early as possible because generally we work very closely with our global network, whether it's partners who we work closely with, whether it's experts in specific areas like game design, performance marketing, user acquisition, growth. There might be a lot of things that you might not have 100% understanding off the bat, but that's probably okay. in the early stages of startup development, these are things that you will figure out as you sort of go through the motions of iteration. And we tend to partner at the extremely early stages itself, help you sort of build that playbook, making those early introductions so that you don't have information asymmetry as a problem, right? So we really make sure that we are making a deliberate attempt to solve for that. So if you are building an ambitious project, either making for an Indian audience or for a global audience, we think there is a phenomenal $1 billion opportunity that can be pursued after. And that just makes it extremely exciting for us to partner at the early stage, have a great ownership, and then see the founders on their journey to become the next stars. So anybody who is building in broadly in the mobile free to play, in the broader video games industry, even if you're toying around with ideas, I think it's probably a good time to have a conversation with us, and then we can figure out how to work together.
Great. I think it was well summarized. And again, with your view, your experience, there's a lot of value you bring first to you with your experience, your broad view, but also as a fund, like you said, like helping to build that ambitious vision where you are aware about the gaps and it's more an intention, like how do we build this together rather than, okay, you need to have everything perfect before you get started. I know there were some studios or future studio founders in India who resonate with what we discussed today. Please reach out to Vivek, Matrix partner, have a conversation, maybe also get feedback on where you're at. Maybe it's also great to know how far or how close you are in your future fundraising and maybe working together in bridging those gaps. So, thanks a lot, Vivek, today for your insights.
No, this has been amazing, Sophie. Thank you so much and really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation here. Would also love to send a note out to our partners across the globe. I do hear a lot of folks who are actively trying to invest in India or do want to be part of that growth story, but do want to take a deliberate, cautiously optimistic approach at it. So, in case there are opportunities for you to think deeper about the space, we are always open to being a sounding board for you to think about your market entry. So, happy to have any of those conversations as well.
Yeah, that's an amazing one. Thanks a lot. I think also companies or ventures from outside of India that could be quite interesting in what's happening there. So thanks, Vivek. I wish you a great day and take care.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Rise and Play podcast. I am growing a community of conscious leaders across the industry and beyond. If you want to join this movement, please share the podcast with other conscious leaders because we have so much more we can learn from each other. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate the show on Spotify or your other favorite podcast platform. It will help other growing leaders to discover the show and benefit from the valuable insights. If you would like to grow rapidly your leadership skills, you can find more insights on riseandplay.io, where you will also find my free masterclass on conscious leadership and other resources that I offer. Have a great week and remember to take care of yourself. Until the next time.